It's mostly UFO and supernatural stuff I've seen out on the interstate. Within the first few months of driving, if I recall correctly, was PA. My first couple years, I was a night driver, so it was hard to see things sometimes. But the one in PA was me trying to follow a flatbedder who was hauling serious ass through the mountains. At one point, I start to fall back because I can feel the van starting to lean. It wasn't long after that I reached down to take a swig of the handy monster I had, and I look up, and there's a guy standing off to the shoulder just outside the tree line, wearing what appeared to be some type of soldier's uniform. Looked like Revolutionary War era. He had a musket as well. As I approach, I can see him staring right at me, and then he starts walking back into the tree line, still looking at me. Before he manages to make it through the trees, he disappears, like literally vanishes in thin air. I had my windows down, and the air in the area got real cold. After about a mile, the air warmed up again. I had a really sad feeling come over me for a while afterward. Needless to say, I didn't stop for the rest of my shift. New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah are some states that to this day I still see shit in the skies that I can't explain. Lights rapidly changing direction and taking off at blinding speeds, but no sound barrier being broken. I've seen lights hovering over the desert several miles off the interstate, then it suddenly takes off and lights cut out. Various shapes and sizes from what I can make out. Again, night driver. I know military aircraft pretty well. Some of them more than likely were, but some of them absolutely cannot be any military aircraft currently in mainstream use. Conventional aircraft do not move like that. The most vivid one would be at an off-ramp in New Mexico. I stopped to take a piss, and decided to turn it into a 15-minute break since my ass was sore anyway. As I'm stargazing and admiring how clear the sky is, I saw what looked like a formation of lights in the shape of a triangle lift off from the desert floor and then take off into the sky. I kept my eyes on it, and it just kept gaining altitude until the lights just disappeared. I look down at my watch and notice it's not ticking, so I pull out my phone and it's off. I turn my phone on, and according to the time on my phone, it had been 5 minutes since my watch stopped. I felt like whatever it was that just took off had something to do with it. Kent, Texas is another one. There's an old Chevron station, I think it is. Seems like FedEx drivers like stopping in there in droves. I'm guessing it's a popular drop and hook point for them or something. But I stopped one day and I need to take a piss. I don't know why I didn't stop in Van Horn. So I pull off and I roll up to the empty lot across the street. Kent is an abandoned town. I walk up to the bush line and notice a makeshift fire pit. The wood is somewhat burned, but not all the way. The weird thing is that there's an unscathed dollar bill stuck in the wood. For a second, I was like, ooh, piece of candy. But then the sudden feeling of nope came over me. So I left it alone and pissed in the bush. As I'm walking back, I look over at it and get a real negative feeling. I look to the ground in front of me and bam, there's a rattlesnake looking right at me. I stop dead in my tracks and walk carefully around it, and it keeps staring at me. I ran as fast as I could back to my truck, feeling like somebody was behind me. I kicked up a lot of dust getting out of there and have never stopped in Kent since. Missouri. I stopped at an off-ramp to stretch out and take a breather. As I'm smoking a cigarette, a little girl from some direction I couldn't figure out giggles and says, "Hi, mister." My initial reaction was, the fuck is a little kid doing out here at this time? So I talk back and say hi. She then responds with, "My mommy says you'll be okay. Don't worry." Now utterly confused, I asked her what she means. No response. Then suddenly I feel like somebody is standing next to me, but it doesn't feel negative or bad. It just feels like somebody is right there next to me. Since it didn't have a negative vibe to it, I just finished my cigarette and left. Later on down the road, I realized that I forgot to fuel up at my last stop when the warning light came on. So I scrambled to look at my GPS and find the nearest truck stop. I find one and set the course. As I roll up to the truck stop, my truck starts sputtering and I barely make it to the fuel line before the truck starts dying. I ran out of fuel right as I got on the fuel line. It wasn't until I was fueling up that it occurred to me what the hell happened at my last stop. One occasion in Arizona, a WTF moment. A lady was begging for money, which isn't uncommon at truck stops. She gave me the whole sob story of her boyfriend left her. She didn't have a job, lost the apartment, her 2 kids were hungry, and she didn't know what to do. Me being a social creature, I let the conversation go on for some reason. To make it short, she was molested by her father as a child, raped on several occasions in her teen years, and then found a lesser of an evil boyfriend who tried to get her into drugs, got her pregnant, and beat her all the time. I hear that kind of stuff all the time, but just in case she was telling the truth, I gave her what I had in my pockets. It ended up being $40. She broke down and cried right there. Then I started to wonder that maybe she was telling the truth. She walked away after some more small talk. I go inside to get dinner, and bigger than shit, I see her with 2 kids that look as sad as can be getting dinner. They all look depressed. I knew then that she wasn't lying about anything she told me, and I felt a lot of remorse for not doing more. I told the waitress to put their meal on my tab. The look on her face when the waitress said their meal was being paid by somebody else was a look I'll never forget. I've seen drivers duke it out on the fuel line many times. I've seen brawls happen in the back of truck stops, many rookies hitting other trucks on accident, you name it. The most memorable fight was when I was on a trip with a co-driver whom we shall say our partnership fell apart real fast on the way home. In Arizona, I stopped at a truck stop between Flagstaff and CA State Line. After an eternity, I finally get pull up on the fuel line. I fuel up and go inside to take a shit and get something to drink and snack on. I come back and the sleeper curtain is open, no co-driver. Lovely. 30 to 45 minutes goes by and he comes out. That's cool. Take your time because I ain't stopping from here on out. Get it all out now. Put some trash in a couple bags and put it on the floor. It was mostly his trash from his shift prior that I couldn't stand having in the cab anymore. He opens the door and dumps the bags on the ground. So I lit his ass up with all the fury that I could muster up. 2 garbage cans 20 feet away. Holy shit. No. I go put the bags in the trash cans and come back to the truck. As I'm doing my logbook, I look up and glance at my mirror. I see 2 drivers flapping wings at each other, getting a big dick. Oh good, a fight. Let's watch. Suddenly they go at it like baboons. Fists flying, but they're not landing any hits. Then one of the drivers picks up the trash can and throws it at the other driver. The can hits him square in the face and blows open with paper towels going all over the place. WWE had just rolled into a town apparently. So I get out and start walking back to watch, and apparently every other driver on the fuel line had the same idea. The driver who got trash canned reaches into the storage compartment in his truck and pulls out a huge chain with a big padlock on it. Swings furiously as he's coming back to the front of the truck where the trash canner is. Mr. Chain Gang takes out the pump, takes out his driver's side window, knocks the mirror off his truck, puts a huge gouge in his fender, and then makes it to the trash canner. The guy runs around the other side of the fuel pump, grabs the squeegee, and starts beating Chain Gang with it. All it does is get the guy wet and piss him off more. So now it's a battle of melee weapons. Enough time rolls by that they realize neither weapon of choice is doing any good. So in an epic sequence of moves, they bear hug the living shit out of each other and flop to the ground and start bicycling each other. I walk inside and tell the lady that there's a fight on the fuel line, and she bolts out the door and breaks them up like a chaperone breaking up two kids fighting on the playground. All this because supposedly Chain Gang said some shit to the trash canner's wife. His argument was that he didn't do anything. She just walked up and started picking a fight. I believe the chain ganger more than the trash can guy. When I was a kid, there was a family of borderline mentally challenged people in my dad's small church group. I mean, the husband and the wife were both very simple, as were their two kids. He was a diligent and careful truck driver though. That job was his life, and he was so proud of it because he was a useful contribution to society instead of sitting around on disability pay. I guess a woman committed suicide by driving across the interstate median and getting to run head-on into his truck. I remember him talking to my father right after it happened. Everyone still thought it was an accident at that point, and he kept stressing how he had tried to avoid her, and it seemed like she was actively steering towards him. Lo and behold, a few weeks later it comes out that the woman was suicidal and left a note saying something to the effect that she was leaving and never coming home. She had intentionally hit him. He was cleared of any disciplinary action from his company, but he never worked again. I heard that his family was evicted a few months later and he was in a mental hospital because his fragile psyche was done for. This was 20 years or so ago, so I don't know what happened in the end. My dad has been a truck driver my whole life. The one that sticks out the most to me is when he saw someone in his company accidentally kill a lady. Or rather, the lady was killed by the guy's truck. There was a notoriously bad intersection outside Seoul City, IA, and this woman just blew through it illegally and out in front of my dad's coworker's loaded semi, with my dad behind him. A lot of people don't realize that trucks can't slow down like a car. They have to gear down because of how heavy they are. She was killed instantly, and her family later tried to sue the company my dad worked for, which went nowhere. Also, when I was a kid, he was in a grain elevator explosion. My dad's truck was like the 10th in line. The first couple of trucks were basically vaporized. It was a pretty scary day because we saw about it on the news before he was able to get a hold of us. He had a number of post-traumatic incidents after that, unsurprisingly, but didn't realize what they were until I told him. He once had a panic attack because he saw a bunch of kids running away at the same moment a train whistle blew loudly. I've seen fistfights at the fuel islands over people not pulling up, which is a big deal for us drivers. Had an RV crawl up alongside me once in Indiana. I have a habit of looking over when folks get up alongside me to check and see if they are paying attention to the road or their phone or dozing off. Anyway, I glance over to see how old this couple in this RV may be. I was surprised to find the driver was maybe 30, tops. He looks over and smiles, and as sure as God's got sandals, the next second later, a young naked woman is bent over the passenger side of the dash and is being acted upon by another young naked woman with what appears to be a horse-shaped and sized dildo. Having seen this before, I click the cruise back a notch or two and let them go on. I was in deep South Texas coming out of Laredo. A Mexican truck, you can spot one easy when you know what to look for, starts coming up alongside me. He gets up next to me and no one is at the wheel. I see two straps on the wheel and can only assume the dude was attempting to drive from the sleeper with a set of reins. I backed way off and let them get on ahead of me. Saw them, there's 3 of these ass clowns in one truck, later at the border. Check on 35 in handcuffs. I was running on Kansas Highway 96 out of Great Bend early one morning. Dawn was just peeking over the horizon back to the east. I rounded the curve out of town heading west when I see Bambi and the gang crossing the road. Must have about 12 or more of them. I get up in the middle of the road and lay on the air horn. They stop crossing, but they all start running along both sides of the road in the direction I'm going. I get back on the throttle, and just as I come up on the group, I see 2 of the deer on the north side deciding they now want to join the group on the south side. Reflexes kicked in, and I jumped into the oncoming lane to avoid them. I saw one's face clear as day as my fender door went past him. He didn't hit the front corner of my trailer or my drives, luckily. However, he did hit his head on the side of my trailer by my back hopper on the side. He went under my trailer, tandems where he exploded. I was over gross weight, so he didn't stand a chance. I pulled over about a mile up the road where it was wide enough to do so in a 2-laner and went to look over my trailer. I didn't see any marks on my trailer or hopper, nor anything much on the trailer tandems. The only thing left was a tuft of fur or 2 and blood dripping off both mud flaps. R.I.P. Bambi. For a large truck in those conditions. Finally, the rain passes, so he keeps going. A few miles up the road, he comes upon a massive wreck. Apparently, the dump truck had slammed right into the back of the sports car. There were 4 college kids in the car coming back from spring break. He goes to see if anyone's injured, and it's a bloodbath. The 2 guys in the back died instantly. The driver died on the way to the hospital. The guy in the passenger seat survived, but he had to have both of his legs amputated because they had been crushed by the dashboard. The dump truck driver survived with pretty much no injuries. A state trooper shows up and sees the wreckage. He goes up to the truck driver and punches him in the face. None of the other drivers said anything. When I was getting my forklift certification, I met this trucker lady who told me the story. An agricultural company was filling her trailer full of lettuce. It was in a huge lot where they were filling lots of trucks, so the whole thing was being coordinated by these 2 managers. They were husband and wife. It was a rush job, so there were forklifts zipping about, full steam ahead. They fill up her truck. She leaves, and later that day she keeps getting calls and CB messages being passed around that they can't find the wife anymore. They thought she had left her husband and taken off with one of the drivers. No one knew anything. When they finally unloaded the truck, they found out what had happened. The wife had got caught in front of a forklift as it was loading a giant crate of lettuce into the truck. It had carried her all the way to the front of the trailer and crushed her against the inside. Definitely dead. It was a really sad story, especially as the trucker lady described how destroyed the husband was. I was not prepared to hear it at 7 a.m. on a Saturday before 12 hours of forklift certification. Spent the past 10 years as a truck driver, so I've had my share of stories, but I'll share the strangest. Coming out of our Washington State terminal, I was asked to take one of our drivers to Southern California. Not a big deal, I've done it before, but let's meet our friend Gibson. See, Gibson here seemed very normal, cheerful, and a delightful person to keep you company while talking your ear off. However, this all changes once the sun went down. Gibson here turns to me and says, "Hey, can you pull over for a sec? I need to ward off the snake people." This is where my brain doesn't quite process this, and I say, "What?" He repeats the same line, and here's where my spidey senses tells me if Gibson doesn't ward off his snake people, I'm going to have a bigger problem than this guy's cookie getting flipped. So I pull over, and he gets out. Now here comes the weird. He does this dance in front of my headlights, and all I can say is, he certainly does his snake warding dance. Now here's my dilemma. This guy obviously has a few fries short of a Happy Meal, but I was asked to drive his ass to SoCal. Unfortunately, I think too long about this, and Gibson is sitting again next to me in the passenger seat, as nothing has happened. I drive 1,200 miles without stopping, and Gibson gets to his new truck in SoCal, and I never give another person I don't know a lift. Ever. I'm probably late, but this is a story of my dad's. About 17 years ago, my dad was a bait fish hauler who made runs from Arkansas to the Northeast and Midwest. At one point, while he was in Ohio, traffic came to a dead halt. Accident right up ahead of him. A car had been barreling down the highway and drove right under a truck and hit the dot bar. Dad noticed the smoke, figured it meant a fire was starting up, so he jumped out and ran up to the back of the truck where a bunch of other truckers and some drivers were. The engine fire was indeed starting, and there were 2 kids in the back seat of the car, real disoriented from the impact. The back passenger window was too small in the car for them to smash open to get the kids out, so they had to go through the front passenger window. Dad was the only one with a small enough frame of the group willing to climb in, so he did. Unfortunately, the driver was too stupid and hadn't been wearing a seatbelt. He'd been decapitated and his body was laying over the passenger seat. So my dad had to climb over him between the front seats and pull 2 kids who were basically dead weight out. He managed to do so. The car was mostly engulfed in flames about 15 minutes later. They handed the kids off to an elderly couple who took them back to their car and cleaned the blood off them and gave them some sandwiches they packed. State troopers got there a while later, took statements and all that from everyone. State boys went back and checked on the kids. They were mostly fine, just a little shook up. The oldest one was a little girl, and Dad had to chuckle at one point when the little girl said, "Mama's gonna be mad at Daddy this time." Made him wonder what other boneheaded moves the dude had done in the past. I remember when Dad came home after that run, he had a styrofoam ice chest with him that had his clothes in ice water. Those clothes had just been absolutely drenched in blood. Luckily, all came out in the wash, which was good with him because it was his favorite jeans covered in blood. My uncle was a truck driver for many years. He doesn't share a lot of stories, but he told me this one night while we were drinking beer. He spent several years doing cross-country trips, often loading up his trailer in the middle of the night. While he waited for his trailer to be loaded, he'd make his way over to a nearby truck stop, have a late-night meal, and shoot the shit with any other drivers there. After a while, he would make friends with drivers that were on a somewhat similar schedule. He befriended this particular guy that he would run into about once or twice a month. He He said this guy was massive, a huge guy. My uncle is kind of a wise ass that can get annoying real quick. He said this was the one guy. He knew that when he crossed the line and agitated him, it was time to go. Anyway, he runs into this guy every so often, and they shoot the shit and kill time while their semi-trucks are getting loaded up. One night, the guy invites him back to his semi. He wants to show him something that he's built in his semi. The guy's semi has a sleeper on the back, so it's pretty big. Basically, it's a semi-truck with a small room right behind the driver to sleep in. My uncle is intrigued by seeing what kind of custom work this guy has done in his semi, so he goes along with them. Once they're in the truck, the guy shows him what he's built in the sleeper of his semi. It's a big heavy-duty box. Apparently it has hydraulic arms on either side so he can open it and close it with the push of a button. He says once he pushes the button, it seals shut, it can't be opened. My uncle is kind of weirded out by this and cracks a few jokes about the box. The guy starts to get a little agitated. My uncle realizes this and decides it's time to leave this guy's semi. A few months later, he finds out the guy was a serial killer, stuffing truck stop hookers and others into this custom hydraulic box. At this point in the story, his hands start shaking and he can barely drink his beer. That guy is massive, he says. His hand could cover most of my head. He could have stuffed me in the box and there's nothing I could have done to stop him. Or shit, maybe there was someone in there already. He says he still has nightmares about it years later. A little late, but here's mine. For the past 7 years, I've been a bull hauler. I've seen some messed up stuff having to do with cattle, but the scariest thing that ever happened to me was on a trip to East Texas. I had left out from around Austin and went up to just north of Amarillo to kick them off at a feedlot around a 600-mile trip. I was feeling pretty good, so I decided to turn around and come back to the cattle company instead of taking my break. I called dispatch and he gave me a sale barn to go pick up and bring back to the company. When I got back, I was pretty worn out, but they told me that a truck had broken down, headed to Texarkana, and he needed me to go and get the cattle. I thought, sure, I can do this. I made it about an hour from Texarkana, on a little 2-lane Texas back road, talking to a friend of mine on the phone to try to stay awake, when I fell asleep. I remember hearing my friend yelling my name and waking up just to find myself off in the grass with a cowboy on a horse right in front of me roping a calf. He roped, dallied off, and turned to face me, and just as I hit him, he disappeared. It was a hallucination. It scared me so bad, I was wide awake for the rest of the trip. I used to think that being an outlaw was being a badass. I'd run 15 to 2,000 miles with no sleep and just call it another day at work. I realize now that it is just me being stupid and putting myself and innocent people in danger. My dad is a truck driver. He doesn't really do long hauls, but just around town. So when he was hauling gravel trains, he had 2 trailers on. But he was also following another person who was hauling the same thing, with sand. But as he was going along, they were coming up to a curve, and there was a guy standing on the side of the road. Sadly, the guy decided he wanted to take his life, so he dived in front of the truck. Not my dad's, but the guy he was following. So my dad just saw all the splatter from the aftermath. You can imagine being run over by an 18-wheeler. But also, he had to drive the truck to the police station for an investigation afterwards, since the actual driver was pretty shaken up. And about a week later, they found the guy's car left in a parking lot with a suicide note inside of it. Another story was another suicide attempt. Once again, he was following another person, but but this time the guy was driving and he decided to turn in front of the guy he was following. The driver didn't swerve soon enough, but it just ended up hitting the driver's side of the car and it ripped the whole one side off. Along with that, took off his arm and he flew out of the car and went into shock. You can once again imagine what the scene looked like. Let me preface this by stating that almost all the encounters that I've witnessed have been with at least one other individual. The first two encounters happened on 2 consecutive days in 1997, and the numerous other encounters happened over the span of 90 days, a year and a half ago. I do not recall being abducted. I have filed reports with the incredibly incompetent MUFON. Back in 97, my buddy and I had just finished up our shift at a pizza joint. It was after 11 p.m. We were worn out and wanted to get stoned. We were completely sober. Anyway, we drove out into a cornfield in the off year, so it was full of rye. We were about a half mile off the road. It was pitch black, and because of our vantage point, I could see headlights in any direction for a good mile. We were way out in the country, so no worries. My buddy starts breaking up the weed when I notice what I believe to be truck headlights shine directly from behind, take a hard left, and disappear. My buddy didn't seem to notice, but I became frantic. I thought it was the cops. My friend thinks I am messing with him and continues breaking up some really terrible brick weed. I recall looking at the stars, and one star in particular grabbed my attention. I can't tell you why, but it looked like your average star. Within 30 seconds, this star starts moving up and down, side to side and in circles. I yelled in a panic, "What the fuck is that?" My buddy gives a dismissive sigh, and then he looks where I'm pointing. For 5 minutes, the UFO continues to move in very fluid movements, making impossible maneuvers, and does so in complete silence. Without notice, this one object becomes 5 equally impressive star-like objects. They stayed close together. At times they moved in some kind of formation, and other times they seemed to move independently. Just as quick as the 5 came, they fused back together as one. We were in shock, but we didn't feel like we were in harm's way. We were recapping what we witnessed, but that single UFO was still there. It wasn't moving much. We thought things were coming to a close, but we were wrong. This time, the one object turned into at least 7 objects. The way they moved and jerked around felt aggressive to me. My friend must have felt the same way because he said he was starting to get nervous. I told him we should go. I embarrassingly confessed that I knew it was there for us, and I became fearful. We haul ass out of there, and the thing follows us to the outskirts of town. The night after the above story, me and the same buddy walked across my apartment complex to go visit a neighbor that was about to grill some burgers. The sun was just starting to set on a humid midsummer afternoon. We knock on the door and my neighbor lets us in. With him was his girlfriend, her sister, and some random guy that I didn't know. I go out back with Ray to chit-chat while he fires up the Kingsford. It's just the two of us, so I take the opportunity to tell him about the previous night. The stars are just starting to come out, and in my storytelling I pointed one out just so Ray would know exactly what I meant. Still pretty much tripped out, so I'm fairly excited when describing everything. I'm almost done with my story, and I noticed Ray looking at the stars that are just beginning to appear. I mean, this guy is looking around everywhere. It's like he became instantly paranoid. While I was mid-sentence, Ray points to the northeast and yells, "Like that? Right fucking there?" Holy shit, the goosebumps. He yelled inside for everyone to come out. They did so, and soon after, the same situation as mentioned above starts to occur. That went on for a bit. It went on so long that everyone but Ray and myself went inside. We ate our burgers while watching this. Behind Ray's apartment was a field. 300 yards away on the other side of the field is a tree line and a creek. On the other side of that tree line is another field. This object slowly descends towards the tree line, and I open the door and yell for everyone to come back out. We watch this huge fiery orb in complete silence land on the other side of the tree line. When we lost direct sight of it, we could still see the light through the trees. Right before the light disappeared, it became very bright. We all kept asking each other if it was real. And this part is where I may lose some of you, but screw it. After several minutes and the end of all sunlight, nothing was happening. Everyone was in and out of the house. I remember standing in front of the back door talking to Ray's girlfriend in the kitchen. Ray, my buddy from the previous night, and the girlfriend's sister were outside. My buddy says, "Oh shit," under his breath and darts past me. The sister is right behind him. Ray shoves me in the door and almost falls on top of me. The girlfriend screams, slams the door shut, and locks it. We all back away from the door. After all the what the F was that speak, we decided it was four-legged, covered in brown fur, and tried to attack us. This apartment was a townhouse. We all went upstairs to get a better look, and there it was, in the shadows. It was pacing around and keeping an eye out. This is when they appeared. They came out of the darkness, and they were short at around 3 feet tall. The skin tone was grayish with a bit of Caucasian color. These were short grays, and there were several of them. Meanwhile, the animal thing starts to climb a utility pole. This isn't a typical utility pole. It has 6 or 8 transformers on it, is H-shaped and kind of low. When the beast starts to climb, I watch it shapeshift to a degree. It decides to perch on one of the cross beams. It looks right at us, but its focus seemed to be on the ETs. It acted like a guard dog, for a lack of a better word. The Greys were clothed and they had some sort of instruments. They seemed preoccupied by the field. They would look at us on occasion, but they were doing something. What exactly? I don't know. This went on for hours. Eventually, we all went back downstairs. Every once in a while, I would go check to see if they were gone. And as soon as it was all clear, I ran home. And that was it. For the next 4 years, I pretty much believed it was random. And then after meeting my biological father for the first time, my ex-wife jokingly brings up my UFO stories over dinner and wine. Crazy. I had a very similar experience once. The crazy part is, I don't in any way believe in UFOs. Even after having had the experience, though I have no good explanation of what happened. Read my history if you want. I'm a pretty staunch atheist and I don't tend to believe in something unless there's a good reason to. I don't trust my own experience even if it was corroborated by others, but this one was really hard to shake off. I was riding home through the country one evening, rural Kansas, and had 3 other friends of mine in the vehicle with me. We were totally sober. I feel like that matters. And we were about 20 miles or so outside of town on a country road in the middle of nowhere. It was 11:30 p.m., late enough that there really wasn't any other traffic on the road, but not so late that it was in the middle of the night or anything. I was in the back passenger seat looking out the windows out into this dark farmer's field that has a tree line that paralleled the road. All of a sudden, just behind that tree line, and it's about 100 yards from us, I see blue lights flashing behind the tree line, and I turn towards my friend who's driving and tell him to slow down. We pull over to the side of the road and look outwards towards the tree line. At this point, the lights are directly perpendicular to our position on the road, but we were behind the tree line. At first I'm thinking it's an electrical substation blowing up or something, But then the blue lights change and start flashing in all kinds of different colors, becoming more rhythmic and bright, casting God rays through the dust over the tops of the trees. At this point, I had stepped out of the car and was watching as the God rays began to descend towards eye level. Whatever it was behind the tree line was rising up towards the top of the trees. At that point, my friend starts screaming for us to go, and we jump back in the vehicle and he takes off like a bat out of hell, flying down the road. The lights continued to rise until they were perfectly level with the treetops, and whatever was on the other side starts chasing the car, staying just out of clear view behind the other side of the tree line. My buddy pegged the car out at over 90. It was a family car and not very fast, and the thing kept perfectly alongside us almost the entire way back to town, and then winked out just before we got there. We talked about it for an hour at a gas station just inside of town, and then decided that we wanted to go back out and see if we could find whatever it was we had seen. But this time we took dirt roads that paralleled the country road, so we'd be on the other side of the tree line. When we got back out there, we saw fire trucks all over the place, driving slowly with spotlights aimed at the fields looking for something. They were canvassing a large area covering about 3 miles. I called the fire department to ask them about it the next day, and they said they had gotten reports of lights or fires from several people over a large area, but that they were unable to find anything. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. When I was around 7 years old, I was raised primarily at the time by my grandparents who lived in a rural county in East Texas. I'll never forget one day when we had a most unusual man come by the house one afternoon unexpectedly. I remember there being a knock at the door as I was playing in the living room at the time and called up to announce to my grandparents someone was at the door. My grandmother took a quick peek out the front window before answering the door, and I remember glimpsing at a very dark colored or black sedan, unsure of the type, parked outside. Thinking back, I find it odd at the time I couldn't recall hearing it pull up, as I had been playing near that window for some time. My grandmother answered the door, and to the best of my recollection, the man revealed himself to be some sort of door-to-door salesman. My grandmother invited him in and called for my grandfather. I never in my life had seen a man so pale. He was dressed in essentially all black, or very dark blue suit, with a matching hat and initially large sunglasses, which initially made me wonder if he wasn't blind. They reminded me of that type, and one of the saddest excuses for a toupee I've yet to bear witness to. I was totally transfixed on the man and couldn't get over the stark contrast of his pale skin to his seemingly drawn-on lipstick with pinkish lips. My fixation became apparent and my grandmother shooed me into a back room as to leave the men to talk, so to speak, uninterrupted. Throughout the visit, I kept trying to sneak peeks at the man and commented to my grandmother whether or not she thought he was sick and he was so pale and thin. Eventually, I suppose he finished his pitch and eventually made his way quite slowly for an exit. I recall as he was leaving, he seemingly thanked both my grandparents. I couldn't make out everything that was said, but I recall he did something more odd than his appearance. He seemed to pass his hands in front of both my grandparents' faces and said something to both, but all I could make out was the word forget, and soon was on his way. My grandparents seemed to be momentarily in a dull fog after closing the door and quietly pulling off. I never saw him drive off. I immediately asked them who was that man, and they looked at each other and said, "What man?" Now, as you can understand, all three of us were quite baffled then, as having no recollection of a visitor, and me having no rational explanation as how in the hell they couldn't remember that fricking wackadoo looking salesman. I went on for weeks asking them who the man was and trying to jog their memory, and as always they said there was no one. They even went as far as to say I was mixing up another business acquaintance of my grandfather and had him drop by one day, but I assured them there was no way I could confuse the two as the man in question was paler than Golem in the LOTR trilogy, and their friend was nothing of the sort. I had almost forgot about the incident entirely until watching a show on SYFY related to a MIB theme, and it came back to me. As recent as a year ago, I tried to bring it up again when I was home visiting, and my grandfather didn't remember a thing, while my grandmother again didn't recall the strange man, but vividly remembers me asking for weeks on end about a strange man, and neither of them ever remembered setting foot in the house. This happened back in the mid-80s, and I'm in my early 30s now looking back, and a lot of the details aren't as crisp, but I know what I saw. "1994, late August, twilight. I and 4 friends were up in Westwood Hills, a public park on the west side of the Napa Valley, above the town of Napa, California. We were all sober, looking east out over the valley. The sun had just set. A huge bright green fireball approximately 20 to 30 miles away to the east came down on a sloping trajectory at about 30 degrees, passing behind the east hills on the other side of the valley before it landed. It looked like it was at least as big as a football field. It was not moving fast like a meteor or shooting star, rather at about the speed of a prop plane. It definitely appeared to be on fire. There was no sound when it landed that we could hear, but there was a visible green flash that we could see against the mountainsides. From what we could tell, it landed a bit northwest of the town of Fairfield, California. We all saw it, and we were all amazed at the color and the size, and that it had been moving so slowly. We watched it for about 2 minutes before it landed. Nothing more happened. Nothing was reported in the papers that we could find. And after talking about it for the rest of summer, we pretty much went on about our lives. Then, I happened across this news story about 10 years later. Crop circles started appearing in Fairfield. I would say this happened maybe 1996. I was about 8 years old. It was getting dark out, but the sky wasn't totally black, like a deep blue. You could make out the clouds fairly easily still and couldn't see many stars yet. We had a large sunroom with lots of big windows, and I was sitting on the floor playing with my Legos. Occasionally I'd get up and walk around or just move around, because little kids can't sit still and don't keep their attention very well. I'd gotten up for a 3rd or 4th time when something outside caught my attention. It was up in the sky, but like I said earlier, it wasn't dark outside yet. I could make out a shape still, like a large triangle with rounded sides. It wasn't moving very quickly and didn't seem to be making any noise, other than a very faint and low rumbling. It was more of a sensation than anything. There were pink lights on the 3 corners that were flickering in a sequence. Left, top, right, left, top, right. There was one light in the middle that faded in and out slowly and was a very, very bright white. It would seem pretty odd for a plane to have lights like that, or for one to be shaped like this. I watched for maybe a good 10 to 15 seconds before it completely vanished. It didn't fly away or move or anything. It was like hiding a layer in a Photoshop, completely gone. I had ran and told my mother, and I don't know if she was just humoring me or actually believed me, but she came out and looked up in the sky with me, and of course there was nothing there. I have a few other stories like this from when I was younger. I haven't seen anything notable in the skies recently. A couple of years ago, I was in central Arizona with a couple of friends driving out on some Forest Service roads around 9 p.m. or so. We stopped at this giant boulder, just sort of jutting out of the ground, and climbed up to sit and enjoy the desert view for a bit. We're sitting there, talking, when I noticed this weird orange light, looking like a bright star out in the sky. At first it's just sitting in one spot, but then it starts moving around fast as hell in all sorts of directions. Just like your typical UFO dancing lights phenomenon you'd see in a hoax video. I can't quite remember how it showed up, whether it just appeared or flew into view, but a second identical light showed up, and these things just started looping and darting around in the sky. At first we chalked it up to some people flying quadcopters, as they were the only thing I've ever seen dart around like that. However, as quiet as we could be, we couldn't hear so much as a low hum. It was dead silent out there. Mind you, I grew up in central MD right under the flight paths for BWI Airport, so I know planes, what they look like, how bright they are, and the weird optical illusions you'll see from them flying through haze and clouds. At this point, we had all lived in Arizona for a few years, so we were all familiar with satellites and how they look. The distances these lights seem to be covering. Picture your horizon as a circle. I'd say they were going back and forth across a distance of about 1/6 of that circle, all while appearing to be on a distant plane. Combined with the total silence, ruled out quadcopters. They pretty much just danced around for a few minutes before they both shot off in one direction, extremely fast, and faded away in the blink of an eye. I don't know what to tell you. I honestly have no idea what they were. The grand reaction we all had was turning to each other afterwards and saying, well, what in the hell was that? If you've gotten this far, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. Please like and subscribe if you like my content. Thank you. I'm not sure if this counts as alien or not, but I definitely saw something I can't explain at all about 5 years ago. I've been dying to tell the story in a thread. About 5 years ago, me and 2 other friends were on our way back from Warped Tour in Maryland, being driven by one of the friends' mom because none of us had a car we could drive yet. It was almost night. The sun was still kind of out and it wasn't that dark yet. We were driving on a 2-lane highway that had trees on either side of the road and a median in the middle of the lanes. Basically, some creature ran out from the trees on the other side of the highway, jumped the median, and sprinted towards the trees on our side. We almost hit the thing, and our friend's mom had to slam on the brakes and everyone in the car was screaming our heads off. Not because it was a look out for the deer situation, but because this was the scariest looking thing I've ever seen. It was black, had long gangly limbs and moppy black long stringy hair. This thing moved so fucking weird I can see it clearly to this day. It galloped so awkwardly, did not run at all like a deer or anything of that sort. When it jumped off the back of its 2 legs and landed again on the back 2 legs before coming down and galloping across the road. Everyone in the car said the same thing, which was, what was that thing? To this day, I'm convinced it was a demon or an alien or an escaped medical experiment. It was large and terrifying, and the way it moved was unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. I wish I had more details, but sadly that's all I remember. I've asked my friends and that friend's mom about it numerous times years after the fact, and it still gives everyone shivers. This is the craziest UFO phenomena true story, and it came from my dad. 1960s in Ethiopia, my dad is just a child, at 9 years old, at the time playing with his best friend Gabriel after school. They were playing in the fenced backyard of my dad's house. My dad turns his back for a second, then turns to look back at his friend, and Gabriel is gone. It's important to note that my dad and Gabriel were from the top 1% of Ethiopia's ruling elite. My dad's father was a minister of interior of Ethiopia, and Gabriel's father was a 4-star general of Ethiopia. The backyard Gabriel disappeared from had 10-foot brick walls with armed guards patrolling on the outside. A couple hours pass. His parents, My dad's parents and guards are searching, but no Gabriel. 48 hours pass. Now there is a nationwide search for this important general's kid, and it's on the news. Police are searching door to door, describing him what he was wearing when he disappeared. He was wearing his private school uniform, a white shirt and brown pants. Helicopters even searched the countryside looking for him, but still nothing. A month passes, then 2, and then 4. People start losing hope that he would ever be found and think the worst. Exactly 6 months to the day he disappeared, Gabriel appears back in my dad's backyard. He was wearing the same white shirt, private school uniform, and it was still clean. He looked exactly the same as when he disappeared. This is where it starts to get weird. Once they confirmed that he was okay, they started asking where he had been. He said a couple nice men took him on a trip. He was in a white room that glowed, and the other children were there from different countries. He said he was surprised that the nice men who looked like white guys could speak Ethiopian, and he could understand what the other children were saying even though they were not Ethiopian. The white glowing room had no windows, and the doors disappeared into the walls. There were buttons on the walls, and if a kid pushed them, a bed would come out of the wall. He said he was then all of a sudden in a city that was glowing, clean, and cars were flying around him. He said there was people there, but they looked strange, like us, but different. One nice man was still with him when he took him to the tall building, where he said he had to stay there for a while, but showed him a room that he could use for entertainment. Gabriel said he could push a button and the room itself goes places. An open field, the beach, the room itself even flies. He said after a couple of hours he was taken back to Ethiopia and appeared in the backyard. He thought he was only gone for a couple hours total. No one believed him, and Ethiopia being a super religious country, most adults around him thought he got possessed by the devil. Gabriel even was forced to see a priest to get the evil spirits out of him. My dad still kept in contact with him throughout their lives. Gabriel got a doctorate in physics and I believe works Holland still. Mine happened in the early 2000s. I was around 16. Me, my brother, my friend, and friend's father were catfishing on Lake Okeechobee in Florida. The father had a large pontoon houseboat, so we stayed out there all night. Anyways, the father had went to bed at about 2 a.m. I decided I was going to bed. I laid down for about 5 minutes when my brother and my friend came into the cabin and told me to wake up. I wasn't asleep yet, so I just got up. We walk out on the deck and they both just point out west in the sky. There was this orangish blue ball kind of floating but moving side to side a bit. We just stared at it for a few minutes. As we kept watching, it would change color. Change from orange to bluish to greenish and back. There was no pattern. It also moved different directions. Finally, after a few minutes, it just hauled ass and was gone. We weren't drinking or doing drugs, but we all saw it. It kind of freaked us out, but it was pretty cool. I have no idea what it was, but it was very strange. It wasn't a helicopter or plane, I do know that. Mine happened probably back in 95 to 96-ish. At the time, I was a pizza delivery guy. I was out on delivery, and after the delivery, I was returning to the store. While driving along the highway, I noticed 3 still lights almost in a row, way off above the horizon. It was evening and dark, and stars were visible. First thought was that they were planes from the airport, as they were way brighter than the stars that were out. They only looked still because I was driving on the highway and my mind was playing tricks on me. Over the course of the next few minutes, as I was continuing down the highway, I noticed the center light started moving up. It continued into the shape of a triangle. I continued to try to keep an eye on triangle of lights in the distance as the whole thing started moving up in the sky. I eventually lost eyesight of this thing behind the trees and whatever else and made it back to work. Was utterly confused by the whole thing. Didn't tell anyone because I figured they'd think I was crazy. I kinda even thought to myself I was seeing things and making shit up. Don't know why I remember this part. This all happened about a week before the Super Bowl. Might have even been the Friday before Super Bowl. All I remember is that before the Super Bowl I was watching the Sci-Fi Channel. Some show was on about people who had seen UFOs or whatever. I was skeptical at best. Then they did a segment on the numerous sights of triangle-shaped lights, and they started showing clips of the few examples that people had caught on video. It was exactly what I had seen. Never saw anything since, and no one else reported any strange sightings that weekend that I knew of. Of course, I was a dumb early 20s kid, so I didn't pay attention to local news, but I'll never forget that incident. Saw a UFO up close, probably from 30 feet away tops. I'm pretty certain that it was of a military design though. I was out driving with my younger brother near a military base in Tucson, Arizona, probably not even 2 miles from my house. It was about 10 p.m. or so and there were no cars on the road. I was making a left at an intersection, and right as I completed my turn I heard it. Approaching from behind us, literally the sound that they play as an effect for hovercraft in movies. That was what I was hearing. It started out quiet but got louder as the craft got closer. Since it was obviously heading above us, my brother leaned out the window and exclaimed loudly,
"Whoa, it's a fucking UFO."
To which I responded by hitting the brakes. What I saw shocked me and has had me convinced ever since. As I came to a stop, the craft glided above us and I watched the wings detached like a transformer robot and lower themselves from the craft by about 5 to 10 feet. The wings at this point were supported only by 2 rods connected to the craft. There were 2 giant thrusters on each wing as well, and an even larger one on the bottom of the main body of the craft. The shape and the movements suggested that it was some sort of VTOL mode, because as it changed into this VTOL mode, it swung around and did a complete 180 over a 2-story building just ahead of us to our left, barely missing the roof with its wings, and then it's reconnected the wings forming a triangular shape, and it boosted off back over our heads at an incredible speed. To further describe the craft, it had 2 modes as far as we could tell. One where the craft is consolidated into a triangular shape and seems to be designed for quick horizontal travel, while the other mode allowed for VTOL movements. It could switch between modes in like 5 seconds or less, and in VTOL mode, it almost looked like the body of a stealth bomber, but with 2 sword-shaped objects underneath it. And of course with thrusters facing at like a 45-degree angle, but they were just adjustable. The whole thing was pitch black and we would have never noticed it if it had the radio off and heard it approaching from behind. I could come back later with the drawing of it, guys, if you're interested. I got an incredibly good look at it because even though it was late, the craft was flying so low that I could see it via the streetlights. My brother was so scared afterwards he immediately called the cops. Pretty amazing experience all in all. This event occurred in 2011 and has haunted me every day since. I work in networking and all of our hours are late. I usually get off around 2 a.m. and then I'm up for a few hours before I go to bed. This evening I got off work and it was raining really bad on my way home. When I got home, by chance, the clouds broke and I stepped outside to have a quick smoke. One of my buddies called me and we were chatting about work. It was still not raining and there were low-lying clouds. There were orange streetlights in Allen and they were reflecting off the bottom of the clouds, creating artificial light. There was a pretty good breeze whipping around, but no rain. I was facing the west and I looked to my right and I see a black cube moving out of the north and traveling south at about 60 to 80 miles per hour. It was moving with a corner forward. This thing was huge. I was astonished to the core of my soul. I sat speechless for a few seconds knowing that I was seeing something amazing. It was 80 to 100 feet tall. It It was a black cube in shape and looked like a rough stone surface. On the side of the cube was a border, and within the border was a circular symbol, if that's what it even was. It looked like if you were to draw a circular maze. It was disturbing the air behind it, and it created a vaporous trail spinning behind it and then disappearing. There was absolutely no sound. None. If you know Dallas, it was traveling in the direction of southbound 75 Central Expressway towards downtown. I told my buddy what I had seen, and he lives a few miles south. I fumbled over my words telling him and asked him to go outside to see if he could see it. He went out to the middle of the street and looked in the direction that it was coming from. After about 5 minutes, it started to rain again. He stood out in the rain for another 15 minutes but never saw it. Good friend. Anyways, no one can ever tell me that I didn't see what I saw that night. I've been ridiculed and laughed at, but I know what I saw. It was almost a relief at this point to know that they really are here. I've been a long-time lurker and I had to get this off my chest. I've been searching Black Cube UFO for years now, every single day. I cannot stop thinking about it. I have to see it again. When I was about 12, my family bought a fishing cabin by a small river about 70 miles from our home. On our first visit to stay in this cabin, it was kind of a work vacation, meaning we were painting and fixing and stuff as well as fishing. One of the people who lived near this cabin came over to say hi and introduce herself. During the course of her visit, she told us, "Don't be afraid of the purple glowing mist you will see. It's just from the UFOs and it won't hurt you." All of us kids snickered at this while elbowing each other, so my mom chased us off and apologized to the woman. She later yelled at us for being rude. 2 nights later, we were out night fishing with our dad. The stars were amazing looking without the city lights pollution, and we were all pointing at different constellations and challenging each other to name them. My youngest brother pointed to a perfect circle of about 7 bright stars and asked, "What are those called?" We all kind of froze and stared because, well, there is no such constellation, yet here it was. While we were looking at it, all the stars took off silently in different directions and vanished over all the surrounding horizons. We ran. Looking back, it was stupid to run. I mean, the things were already gone, but we were spooked and we ran as fast as we could back to the cabin where Mom was sleeping. About half the way there, our dad overtook us and ran straight into the cabin ahead of us, slamming the door. When we got in the cabin, he told us, "Just shut up and go to bed." He sounded angry, so we did just that. The next morning at breakfast, when he tried to talk about it, Dad angrily said that he didn't remember any of that and to stop with the stupid stories. My sister asked,
Why did you run then?
He said that he was tired and wanted to go to bed was all. He was tired, so he ran? My dad could be a real goober sometimes. This wasn't the only time we saw things in the sky while staying there, but it was the most interesting. We tried on a few occasions to get pictures, but it was the early 60s and cameras sucked half the time back then. At least the cheap kid cameras we had did. We were afraid to ask to use Dad's good camera for that. We only had that cabin for a few years when my dad suddenly sold it. We never could get him to talk about that night. He would firmly deny it every time we tried. Never did see the purple glowing mist though. We looked for it. This actually occurred last week on January 15, 2016. I live in Outer Sunset in San Francisco, and around 7 p.m. poked my head out the window to see if it was raining. It wasn't. I heard a loud aircraft overhead, which was several magnitudes louder than the planes that normally fly in the area from SFO. I looked to my left and saw a plane that appeared to be a commercial aircraft, but I noticed it was much larger and the lights were super bright and creating large cones of light ahead of it. I remember thinking how neat it looked being able to see so much of the craft and area around it lit up with such a cloudy evening. When I tried to focus in on it, the lights flickered off and I lost it completely. I could still hear it very loudly though. About 10 seconds went by and I see something come alight about 2 blocks to my right. I see a lot of commercial aircraft out there, but this was easily 4 to 6 times larger in the sky than they normally appear. The lights were strange too. I saw what appeared to be 4 white jet exhausts, and across the whole craft there were blue and red lights in lines slowly glimmering. It moved much slower than regular planes and was visible for about 10 seconds, moving north along the beach. It then vanished after about 10 seconds. Confused as all hell, I looked around to see if anyone else had witnessed it. Lo and behold, someone on the corner of my street who was riding their bike had stopped and was gazing up at the sky in the same location as the craft had been. I shouted down to them, "Hey, did you see that? What was that?" They turned and looked at me, looked back at the sky, then back at me, then without saying anything got on their bike and rode away quickly. I could still hear the craft, so I got onto my roof and about half a minute or so later saw it come from behind me and slowly fly west out over the ocean until it vanished. I stayed on my roof waiting to catch it again, but I didn't hear or see it. After about 20 minutes, regular aircraft began flying overhead per usual. My best guess was it could have been some sort of military aircraft, or perhaps several in tight formation. Still the loudest and largest aircraft I've ever seen out there. By the way, thanks for nothing, dude on the bike. A couple of years ago, I saw 2 rather large men having an argument in the street in front of my house. After a couple of minutes, they drove off and went their separate ways. I didn't think anything of it until the next day when I get a knock on my door. Turns out that one of my roommates had been sleeping with a married woman, and her husband somehow found out where we lived and was at our house with a shotgun to kill the guy who banged his wife. The dude had a couple of priors that definitely lent the threat of some credibility. The man at the door was his dad, who told me that the argument was him talking his son down. He told me that he showed up as his son was getting out of the car. He asked me if I was the guy in question and I said I wasn't. He said, "Oh, you're the roommate? He was going to kill you too." Turns out my other roommate had done some things with the young lady as well. The kicker is that I was home alone at the time. Basically, I unknowingly watched a man talk down my future murderer from my dining room window. When I was about 12 to 13 years old, I was waiting for my friends at the entrance to a large park in my city. While I waited, a van pulled up and a guy rolled down his window and asked me, "What are you up to?" To which I replied, "Waiting for my friends," as I paced back and forth slightly away from the van with each step. He said, "Where are they coming from?" And I answered, "From the metro." And he said, "Hop in, I can give you a lift there." Well, at this point I know he's a creeper, so I told him no thanks and began to walk away, while he insisted I accept his lift. I left the park entrance and he pulled into the parking lot, did a U-turn, and drove out of the park along the road I was walking on. Having noticed what he was doing early on, I walked really fast to a hole in the fence of the park and climbed in. From that point, he'd have to do a 8 to 10 minute drive to get back to where I was. Met up with my friends a little bit later and told them the story. One night on my cousin's farm, me, my 2 cousins, and my 2 family friends were sitting on hay bales as it got dark, waiting for the coyotes to come out. Me and the 2 family friends decided it would be funny for one of us to throw a shoe to make some noise and then ditch my cousin on the hay bale. The 4 of us ran to the barn while my cousin stayed on the hay bales. We stayed in the barn for a good 30 minutes waiting for her to come and find us, but she didn't. We went to go check on her, but she wasn't there. We found her back inside the house. The creepy part was when we talked to her. She asked us which one of us had been running around banging on the fence. We got really confused because we had ran straight for the barn, so we asked her what she meant. Apparently she had seen a person sneaking around with a black sweatshirt on with the hood up and had taken a stick and hit it against the trough and the fence several times. She had thought it was us since we were all wearing black hoodies. We were certain she wasn't lying because she had asked us first and proudly declared it didn't scare her. The next day, while all 5 of us were out fishing, my uncle said there were 2 people walking around by the gravel pit near the hay bales who he thought was the 2 of us. We still don't know who was out there or what they were doing. My significant other was in an accident, which demolished her car. After the accident, we stored the car in our driveway with a tarp covering it until the insurance towed it. She was in Canada for a convention, which left me and the dogs alone at home for the weekend. When I got home from work, I thought it was a good idea to call my parents to catch up. The wind was intense that day and blew the tarp off the passenger side of the car. As I'm speaking with my parents, I decide to pull the tarp back over the car. I'm talking with my parents and listening to them describe their day when I hear a faint voice saying, "Hey." I have no idea where it is coming from until I look down. There's a man sitting in my car. I've never seen this man before, but he looks at me and asks, "Where's Dan and Isaac?" Now, I don't know either of these people, and I told him that I did not. I can see he has all of the personal items from the car in his lap. I start telling him that he needs to get out of the car and leave. Then I see the pepper spray in his hands, which was left by my significant other. I knew at that moment that my day would end with being pepper sprayed, so I tell my parents to call the cops. He steps out of the car asking, "Where's the ice?" I just tell him that he has the wrong place and grab the CD case out of his hands. He reaches for the pepper spray and I back up quick. He stops and says, "I'll be back, bro, just you watch." I watch him walk off, and for a brief moment he starts yelling at a tree down the street. The cops came and he was found up the road, but the officers could not find my stuff. The experience definitely freaked me out for the rest of the night. I worked at a campground over the summer and I agreed to do security watch on the Tuesday after Labor Day. It's completely empty all day long and we spend most of the day cleaning and repairing various items in the campground. It was also a family campground with tons of things to do like ziplining, paintballing, go-karting, and hiking. It was relatively large, approximately 50 square acres. Anyways, I'm doing security, which most likely consists of driving around in a golf cart and making sure people aren't doing anything. That night, a motion sensor went off on the upper loop, which had been out of use since July for renovations. Usually when a motion sensor goes off, it's a raccoon or a deer, but we have to check anyways. I make my way up to the motion sensor, which was going off constantly on my way up, and logged it in our notebook. When I got up there was this lady's voice singing in the middle of the night. I walk around and head towards it, which is a bad idea. There was this 40-something meth head in a dress walking around singing. She saw me and chased after me. I ran as fast as I could to the golf cart and took off down to the main office. I called the police, but they were going to be close to an hour. I stayed locked up in the office until they got there. She had paced around the front door and screamed at me the whole time. When they got there, they arrested her and we went up to the same loop where she was to look for more. I swear, looking for more meth heads was more terrifying than being chased by her. She had been living in one of the yurts we had yet to get to for over 2 months. She looked like a witch. The yurt was destroyed and we ended up burning it down. I'm sure most of this thread will be about spooky or paranormal experiences. I've had some sleep paralysis experiences that were creepy, but by far the creepiest experience I've had was just another human being having a straight up lack of boundaries. I was 18, in college, and living with my boyfriend in our first apartment. He had left early for an early class and I had the day off, so I was sleeping in. I awoke to a man I didn't know sitting on the end of my bed staring at me. When he saw me wake up, he said, "It's time to get up now," and just kept looking at me. I was trying to figure out if I was awake or dreaming and if there was anything I could do to avoid getting raped and murdered. He just kept sitting and looking. Figured out I was awake and also remembered that I was sleeping naked, so I didn't want to get up unless he made a move. After what felt like a lifetime of silence, but was probably only a minute, he said it again. "It's time to get up now." I said okay, still too shocked and scared to figure out that I could ask him who he was or tell him to leave, or start screaming for help. He got up and walked out of the room and I heard voices in my kitchen. He left my bedroom door open when he left, so I still didn't want to get up because of the naked thing. After a few minutes, I built up the courage to wrap a blanket around myself, grab some clothes, and dash to the bathroom. As I passed the door, I saw him standing in the kitchen doorway and just staring into my room, watching me run for the bathroom. I got dressed and began to slowly make my way towards my cell phone. I had to pass him again in my kitchen where I could now hear 3 male voices in order to get where it was plugged in. As I passed, I saw that 2 of the men were in plumber outfits and half of my kitchen was soaking wet. Turns out my neighbor upstairs had burst a pipe and these men were here to fix it and needed access to the problem pipe through my ceiling. The man sitting on my bed was with the realty company and had let them in. He says they knocked, but I never heard it and no one had called either myself or my boyfriend to say they were coming over. I have no idea why he thought that was an appropriate way to wake me up or why he didn't feel the need to explain who he was or what was going on. Needless to say, we broke our lease and found somewhere else to live after that. A couple of years ago, I went on my first hunting trip. My girlfriend's dad and I arrived around midnight and it was pitch black out there in the country. While he was inside setting up the cabin, I was outside unpacking the truck by myself. All of a sudden, I hear a man's voice from the abandoned barn about 50 feet from me, saying, "Come over here. Psst, come over here." I stopped and looked over there. I was pretty much frozen in disbelief. Then he continued, "Hey," I said, "come over here. Come on." And then it stopped. I dropped my stuff, walked calmly into the cabin and asked my girlfriend's dad how close the nearest house is. I was told it was about half a mile down the road. After I told him what just happened, he didn't seem to believe me, but took his gun out and he kinda just called over to the area, but there was no response. It kinda freaked me out. On a side note, later that night while I was trying to sleep, I heard a loud crash come from the living room and heard him yell,
"What the fuck?"
So of course I assumed the worst, that the creepy man broke in and was attacking him. I ran out of my room ready for a fight, but found him sitting on a broken heap of wood. Apparently he sat in an old wooden chair and was too heavy, so it broke on him. I had a detached retina at a young age and had to have surgery to repair it. The surgery ended up being around 7 hours long. I remember waking up in the middle of surgery and seeing the reflection off the monitor above me of the medical team working on my eye. I didn't feel any pain, just the complete awareness of the surgery being performed. I remember someone placing their hand firmly on my forehead and saying, "He woke up, prepare another dose." Someone else came into the picture and I went cold again and fell asleep. The creepy part is, each anniversary of the surgery I have night terrors and generally wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. I hate that night because no matter what I do, my body recalls the surgery, and I always wake up dreaming that someone is performing surgery on me, but I am strapped down. I've tried staying up all night when I was 22. I eventually just passed out and had the worst episode where I had sleep paralysis and hallucinated. The surgery was originally supposed to last 4 to 5 hours, but additional work was done and minor complications occurred. The doctors were very good and all still check up on me. I was one of the youngest detached retinas that the team had and get Christmas cards from them still. I don't know why it happens and I can't explain it other than my body just knows. June 17th. I guess it could be similar to phantom leg or something where the body recalls something that isn't there. Tonight is the night. A lot of you have been asking for updates, so here's the plan. Get off work and do some chores around the house. Get the little one to bed and read her 4 stories. Feed my fish, take some painkillers, drink scotch, and play World of Tanks all night on Xbox One. I will update in the morning to see how it goes. I went to bed around 2 a.m. because I couldn't keep my eyes any longer. I woke up around 5:15 with another terrible nightmare. I think it may be a combination of pills and booze, but the dream was replaced with zombies instead of doctors hanging over me. The zombies were clawing at my eye trying to get it out of my head, and I could feel the pressure as they pulled at it. My fiance is a light sleeper and a nurse, so she has that caring mindset, so she woke up. So luckily it didn't last long, as she was gently nudging me to snap out of it, but the bed was soaked in sweat. I didn't sleep the rest of the night and went to watch my fish swim around until everyone woke for Father's Day. A few years ago, my best friend and I went to Adams Morgan, a strip of bars and clubs in DC. It was a Saturday night, so the whole area was packed with people, and we ended up having to park several blocks away in some back alley. As we're walking down the alley, I turn around and notice a man with a backpack several yards behind us. I don't think much of it and we keep walking. A few seconds later, I look behind us again, and now he's a lot closer, so I start speed walking. When I look back again, this man is running at full speed towards us, so I grab my BFF's hand and bolt. We start running full speed down this alley with this guy right behind us and end up running into busy DC traffic, nearly getting hit by multiple cars. It was like a scene out of a movie. We somehow made it across the busy 6-lane street unscathed and watched the man across the street menacingly stare us down before running away, back up the alley. To this day, we still don't know what that was about. And to add, at the time we were 2 20-year-old girls. Yes, we did go back to the car about 4 to 5 hours later, but since we ran, we both never saw what street we parked on. We only had a general idea of the area we parked in. We ended up having to use a cab and drove around DC at 3 a.m. for almost an hour looking for my car. We eventually found it, and thank goodness it wasn't broken into. We asked the cab driver to not leave until we got in and drove off. After all of that, we decided to just party in Federal Hill in Baltimore. We never had problems there. When I was 15, I went into town for my first day doing some charity work. I was early, so I sat down on a bench in town center for a bit. Someone approached me, introduced himself, said he just moved there. I briefly introduced myself and we talked a bit about local stuff. He mentioned he was 26, which weirded me out a bit. He was on his phone and suddenly I heard the shutter sound as it faced me. I freaked out and demanded to know why he was taking a photo. He denied it and claimed to be taking a photo of the scenery in a market town with no scenery. Annoyed and creeped out, I just left with no explanation and went to a charity shop where I spent 6 hours working. So 6 hours later, I left the shop and started heading home. Suddenly I heard my name being shouted from behind me. It was the creep again. I said to him to leave me alone, but he wouldn't listen and said he won't let me walk home alone. I was yelling at him, telling him to go away, and I started walking quicker and he kept up. In the end, I just ran for my life and I made it home safely and never saw him again. This happened to me about a month ago in rural Michigan. I was out in a rural area on a big 5,000 acre patch of state land doing some rabbit hunting by myself. I'd been walking for 2 to 3 hours and hadn't seen a damn thing, so I decided to turn around and start making my way back to where I'd parked my car. When I got back to the main trail, I basically had to walk about a mile east and then take a left and head another 2-ish miles north to get to my car. As I'm walking east, I start to get this really uneasy feeling. Everything is a bit quieter than usual. Quiet even for a day with a decent amount of snow on the ground. The eastbound trail before the turn is a lot of small fields off to the side and hills up until a flat final stretch. As I get up to one of the last hills, I look to my left at a field for a second in case I saw any rabbits or coyotes. By the time I turned my head back straight, there was a guy straight in front of me about 100 yards walking away from me. Something about him didn't settle right with me. He had no hiking, hunting, or camping gear, just a long sleeve shirt and dirty jeans with a beanie hat on. He was walking really strange, not really picking up his feet, just sort of dragging them along, kicking up snow like how a kid would if he was bored. But this was a large grown man. On top of all this was later in the day, almost sundown, and there were no other cars in the area that I'd parked when I'd got there, which was the only reasonable way into the trail, so no way this guy had driven there suddenly to take a quick hike. I keep walking a little slower, and all of a sudden the guy stops, turns his head halfway, and I can tell he's looking at me. He turns his head back and just bolts running. This startled the shit out of me, and I stopped walking. I know there's something seriously wrong with this guy, so I stopped and swapped out the birdshot in my shotgun to a few buckshot shells I always carried in my backpack just in case. Kept walking forward cautiously, and once I got to the turn in the trail, I looked down the trail and the guy is nowhere to be seen. The final stretch of the trail goes about 2 miles and is completely flat. There's absolutely no way he could have made it all the way down the trail by the time I got to the spot, even if he was Usain Bolt. I could see in the snow that he was wearing heavy boots. It's a nice trail, but the sides are covered with thick brush and deep forest. So basically now I knew that this guy was hiding off to the side in the brush somewhere. That had to have been the absolute longest, most unsettling walk I've made in my entire life. I tried to stay with his boot trail in the snow to try and get an idea of where he was, but it was lost in old prints from whatever group had hunted the trail that morning. I racked a shell in the shotgun as loud as I possibly could in hopes that he'd hear it. But that didn't really comfort me that much when I was walking near extra heavy thickets on the side of the tall berms where he could have been. Plus, with the snow, it's hard to hear anything moving around. Even once I got to my car, I was really in the middle of nowhere surrounded by more forest. So I kept the gun loaded with me as I got into the car, so I didn't have to unload it in my trunk and be exposed before I got in the car and locked it. That whole walk I just kept repeating the old biblical passage. As I walk through the valley in the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, in my head pretty uncontrollably. Something just felt very wrong, and I'm never going hunting there again alone. "3 years ago, I admitted myself into the mental wing of the hospital and was put on 48-hour suicide watch. It was about 3 a.m. when I finally finished giving them all of my belongings and had a temporary cot to sleep on while waiting for a room to open up. Mind you, these cots are only separated by a sheet, and there are several unpredictable people around me who were also being admitted. One of these people was a guy my age, about half a foot taller than me, and had this wild look to him. He reminded me a lot of Gary Busey, which scared the shit out of me. Apparently he'd taken a ton of mushrooms, dropped acid, and went on Everclear drinking binge before the cops were called and brought him in. About an hour after falling asleep from Valium that the nurse gave me, I start waking up out of this semi-lucid, groggy, blurred state to see the dim light above me eclipsed by a figure. I assumed it was a doctor or nurse, but as my vision became clearer, my heart began to pound. The wildly pulled hair, wide open manic eyes, and full-toothed smile was inches above my face. I felt as if I were paralyzed, hoping I could sink deeper into the cot while he raised his hand, crooked and wretched like a claw, closer to me. Within seconds, 2 utterly massive security guards sprinted over, one running so fast that he inadvertently tackled the guy to the floor from having too much momentum to stop himself. That was by far the most terrifying experience I'd ever had. The rest of my time there, however, something else disturbing happened. Our actual rooms had double doors with small glass panes on each one. At night, the doors would close and the security would patrol the hallway. For those 2 nights, I would hear the routine footsteps of the guard as he walked past in his heavy boots, but I also heard and saw something entirely different. I began to notice light, rapid tiptoeing in between each round the guard made in my section of the wing square layout. The guard's boots would pass, but a minute later I would hear, I still wish I didn't look. I wish I would have kept my head buried under the covers in that room. I slowly turned my head and raised the sheet until I could just barely see out of my one eye. As I looked at the door, I noticed nothing but the shine of 2 eyes staring at me. It was so dark I couldn't see the face behind them, just eyes. After a minute, horrified, they would swiftly go away, giggling and laughing under their breath until I heard a click of the door closing down the hall. Yeah, that creeped me out alright. That was more than enough motivation to seek out a therapist, and thankfully, I've been depression and anxiety free ever since. Paramedic here. We were called at 2 a.m. to a little town in the hills away from our area. Someone had called with chest pain and needed an ambulance. Took us a while to get up there because the road was unsealed and weaved around the mountainside. We drove into the town and there were no lights on at all except for a phone box lit up on the street. The address was actually a little ways out of the other side of the town, about 3 kilometers or so. But when we got to the street, we found no street numbers. It was very hard to see where we were going, but we soon found a shack hidden behind some trees where we think the address was. So we pulled up and knocked on the door. No answer, and so I knocked again. After about a minute, a woman stepped in from the edge of the door all dressed in white, not saying a word, and standing with her nose pressed against the screen and wide-eyed. I asked if she had called for an ambulance and she just shook her head. I asked if anyone else had, and I could see another figure in white standing further back in the house. No lights were turned on and no one said a word, so we got back into the ambulance and kept searching. We drove to the end of the road, which ended in a property with a huge house that had about 30 windows and a yard full of old cars. No lights were on in the house, and we tried to call and radio our communication center, but we were unable to get to them in any way due to the location. We drove back into the town and decided to use the phone booth to call communications about the job. We found a few coins, and feeling a little creeped out, we got a hold of them. They told us they had no further information for us and to have another look around. As directed, we drove back down to the road and had another look. We couldn't find anything matching the house description we were given, and even had trouble finding driveways. Finally, we got all the way to the end of the street and looked up into the huge house at the end of the road. This time, a single light was on in the front room, and standing looking out away from us into the darkness was a figure all dressed in black with a huge pointed hood. We waited, terrified, to see if this was the called, and he didn't move despite us doing everything to get his attention. After what seemed like forever, my partner started to scream, and we drove as fast as we could away from the house, up the road, through town, and back down the curling road till we got to the highway. Both of us were shaken by the experience and didn't know what to make of it. Once we arrived back in mobile phone range, we called the communication center to explain that we couldn't find the patient despite further searches. The lady on the other end of the phone explained that they were unable to reach the caller again despite trying, and ended up tracing the call to the phone booth we had called them from in town. I hung up the phone and we both sat silently for the ride home, before my partner asked me if I believed in the devil. I told her I don't know. So about 3 years ago, I was taking a year off from college and was back in my tiny hometown in the Midwest. I had a lot of friends in the area and we used to love to go out in the groves, abandoned buildings, and anywhere else to shoot coons, skunks, possums, and the occasional coyote. Yes, it was a pretty redneck pastime, but we also got paid for it. One night, I think it was about late March or early April, like spring was right around the corner, but there was still snow on the ground. About 6 of us went to an old abandoned house a decent way from town. And as we drove up to it, it looked like your average abandoned house. Tall grass all over the yard, including the driveway, broken windows, etc. As we all got out of the truck, we noticed that there was a female mannequin head tied by her hair on a windowsill on the 2nd story. We ignored it and started moving to the front door, which we quickly discovered was locked. Now this is where I usually like to call it and find somewhere else to go, but one of my friends just crawled through a broken window and let us in. Right off the bat, something was wrong. Although there was no furniture or anything else that would show a living person was occupying the house, there was also no dust. I pointed that out and was just told to stop being a bitch by my friends. We walked through the main floor and didn't find anything, and then we checked out the basement. The basement was full of mason jars, like easily 1,000 of them, probably more. I said something was definitely up and we needed to get the F out, but once again my friends told me to man up. They smashed a few of them before I convinced them to go upstairs and check that out. We climbed back up to the main floor and then to the 2nd story. When we got up to the top level, I split off from the rest of the group, pulled out a knife, and cut the mannequin head down. I was looking at it in my hand when my friends called out to me and told me to check out what they found. I ran to them and found about 3 sleeping bags, some old bikes, lots of shoes, and lots of Mountain Dew bottles. Some of these bottles were frozen, and some were not. This is where we all decided it was time to get out of this house. Once out of the house, we waited in our pickup while we decided where to go next. But we figured no one was at the house at the time, so we would do a quick sweep of the barn and corn crib and then leave. We went to a shed quick and shined a light in it, didn't see anything, and headed for the corn crib. I'm not sure why, but I was walking alone to the crib, with one friend following me about 15 feet, and 6 others stayed at the shed for some reason. I was getting close to the crib, but I had my eyes on my gun. I was just checking it over to make sure everything was right when my friend shouted, "Holy shit, I just saw something move through the window on the second story." He then ran up to me and took out a flashlight and shined it at the window. I didn't see anything, but a glimmer of light caught my eye on the main story. I shined my light into the main floor of the crib and there was blood everywhere. Just typing this, I'm getting goosebumps all over. There was blood coming down the wall from the second story, all over the wall and starting to drip onto the floor. It wasn't even starting to coagulate. Got the hell out of there ASAP, as my friends saw it from the shed they were still at. Later that year, in June or so, I told that story to a girl I liked and she didn't believe me. We ended up getting into my truck, driving to the house in the middle of the day, and I put my high beams on the crib without ever getting out of the truck, and the dried blood was still there. But it didn't look like any more ever came from the second story. The summer after, the barn next to the corn crib burned down. The sheriff department said a moonshine installment went wrong and people operating it fled the area. I still have no idea why there was so much blood. It wasn't mentioned in the report at all. I was 17 and working at my first job stocking items at a grocery store. Very mundane, but it allowed me for some freedom. I'd had a few run-ins with random odd people, but nothing I couldn't handle. About 2 months in, I'm shelving on the lowest level in the canned food aisle, and a very tall man comes to hover over me. So close his knees are touching my back. Told myself it was a coincidence and said, "Excuse me." Try to slide sideways out of his way, but he steps around me, trapping me. Tried a few more times to the same result when he crouches down and asks if I've ever had a full body massage. My heart was racing and I was panicked, but like an idiot I froze up, while the guy proceeds to roughly rub my shoulders. At that moment, a coworker popped her head around the corner to see how I was getting along and surprised him. He waved a hand and goes, "Hi," like it was normal. I booked it to the back and told my manager, who in turn told security, who saw him out. I wish it had ended there, but me being, which obviously means stupid, and I was going through a major grown-up/independent streak, had myself a good cry and then refused all offers to go home for the day. I also wanted to talk to the police when they got there. A little over an hour later, still no police. I hear a bunch of ruckus and shouting. Then someone yelled my name, and I went to investigate. It was a coworker trying to tell me to get to the back, but he'd come back with a baseball bat and a Rottweiler looking for me. The pair of them quickly march over to me, all the while the dog is snarling, and he's saying how the dog likes me. He knew it would. I must be good with animals, and he would finish that massage back at his place. I got pinned, but my manager, one of the best women I've ever met, somehow gets herself between me and the dog this guy keeps, not asking, not telling, but commanding me to pet. She stayed there holding on to me behind her back until finally the police get there. After a brief but tense standoff, he's arrested the dog, taken to the pound. I sensibly went home. Several months later, long enough for me to all but have forgotten everything, my manager calls me into her office. She said she wanted to be there when I found out and handed me a newspaper. It took me way too long to register what was so important. The man had been arrested for murder and kidnapping. We both started crying and I went home for the day. I couldn't handle it and wound up leaving shortly after. I think the creepiest, scariest part was how calm he was during the whole thing. Even after the officers got there and his dog started losing its shit, he was just so very, very calm and normal looking, like this was a normal thing. I was in Portland, Oregon about 6 months ago for training at work. A bunch of coworkers and I went out drinking the last night we were there. They ended up going home before me, and I found myself trying to find my way home around 3:30 a.m. with a dead phone. There's a large homeless population in Portland, many of which I passed sleeping on the sidewalk under shop entrances. At one point, I come across a bus stop and what appears to be a little old woman bent over looking for something in her purse. I ask her if she knows which direction my hotel is in, and she whirls around, and I notice her teeth are rotting and they look as if they are sharpened at the end, most likely from decay. She had leathery tan skin, frizzy white hair, and these terrifying light blue eyes that were opened as wide as they would go. She lets out a scream at the top of her lungs, not like a scared scream, but like a terrifying witch scream, and says,
Don't go down that road back there. There's a man with a knife and he's not a good person. Don't go down there. Don't go, he is bad.
She just stands there wide-eyed, repeating that over and over, yelling at my face. I listened for about 5 seconds before I took off the other direction, about to shit my pants. I looked back about a block away and she was still there yelling to me. Most terrifying encounter I've ever experienced. My friend and I experienced missing time, so to speak, while on a canoe trip. About 10 years ago, my friend and I went on a trip to Quetico Provincial Park in Ontario. Quetico is a wilderness park, so there's no car camping or any sort of facilities like that. You get your permit and put it at your entry point. The amount of permits given out is limited to preserve the park, so it's unlikely that you will run into any other people during your trip, maybe a ranger. We put in at Beaver House and our route took us south into the Boundary Waters, a wilderness park in Minnesota. We chose our route poorly and ended up having to take a grueling 8-kilometer portage. We weren't properly packed or light enough to make this portage in one go, which was a big mistake. We also overestimated ourselves and started it too late in the afternoon. I've done many portages before, but this was something else. It had it all. Canadian Shield gnarled roots, rocks and moss, flooded marshland, huge smooth granite saddles, dense humus soil that sucked your boots in, the works. Don't know how long it took exactly, but I'd say at least an hour and a half each way. It didn't help that our canoe was fairly heavy. We tried to save a few bucks by not renting a Kevlar one, and used my friend's rubberized canoe that's meant for running rapids. Thankfully, it was tough, because I must have dropped it at least 50 times, but you can just kick the dents out. Anyway, we're on the way back to get the rest of our stuff and make the second trip, practically on the verge of tears from exhaustion, and it's starting to get dark. Not good. We have flashlights, but setting up in the dark sucks. Don't even mention trying to find a campsite. We load up the food and get moving. 10 minutes later, we round a bend and I see some packs in a green canoe. I think, shit, we must have taken a wrong turn and ended up at someone's campsite. But there were no branching trails and no campsites nearby. I take a closer look and realize it's our stuff. But how? We had passed none of the landmarks we had before, like the granite saddles. We were certainly exhausted, but I find it hard to believe that I could zone out from that many kilometers. And what about my friend? He also acknowledged that we finished the portage in an impossibly short time. I looked at the maps thinking maybe we had accidentally taken some alternate trail or loop back before, but there was nothing. Just 8 kilometers of land between the two lakes. Now that I've typed this out, it feels anticlimactic, but there's just simply no explanation for traveling 8 kilometers in 10 minutes. I'm looking at my old maps now to try and find where this occurred exactly. Last year I was on an outward bound trip in the Rockies on a 14-day expedition. In case you guys aren't hip to the outward bound course, There's a solo about 3/4 of the way through the trip, which is pretty much you're in your own area out of eyeshot and hearing range of other group members for a set amount of time. This expedition had a 2-day one. So on day 11 or so we stopped to do ours. Mind you, this is a 9-day hike from the closest base camp, and we went about a mile off the rugged trail we were taking to set up. I woke up on the second day of the solo and looked out of my tarp and saw a guy about 20 feet away in a solid cherry red hoodie with the hood drawn, strings fully pulled, so his face was entirely covered. I figured this was one of the instructors because they go around sometime on the second day to check on us, so I waved at him and smiled. He then took off uphill and I lost sight in the trees. Come the next day when we were all back and talking about it, I asked which of the instructors had the red hoodie. Turns out neither of them did. There was a man 10,000 feet up a mountain in the middle of the woods who walked by me sleeping in a tent. It had potential to go pretty awry. About 15 or so years ago, when I was 16, I went to visit my aunt and uncle during my summer vacations. They used to live with my family when I was growing up, but had moved to a small hill station when I was 12. Their house, along with the others in the community, was at the foothills of the mountain, while the downtown was about 10 kilometers away, reachable from their house by crossing a bridge over a river. Downtown is where all the shops were, including my uncle's small chemist shop that he operated with the help of a young guy named Kieran, about 23 years old or so. I used to hang out with him whenever I was at the shop. Pretty talkative and friendly guy that lived close to my uncle's house. One afternoon, my aunt asked me to go downtown to grab a few things from the local shops there. She asked me to take the spare scooter that was at their house. Thrilled with the idea of driving, I took the scooter, crossed the bridge, got into downtown, went to a couple of shops and got the stuff. On the way back, I see Kieran walking towards the direction of the bridge. It would have been about 5 p.m. or so at that time, and I assumed that he had left early to go home that day. My uncle would shut his shop by 7:30 p.m. I stopped the scooter next to him, say hi and make small talk, except that he barely talks. Just a very basic yes, no answers. After about 10 minutes or so, I eventually ask him if he is heading home, and he says yes. I offer to give him a ride to his place and he accepts. Sits behind me on the scooter and off we go. It's about 5:30 p.m. by now, and the light had faded fast. The street lamps were on by the time I reached the bridge. Around the middle of the bridge, I start feeling extremely cold, teeth-shattering cold, but by the time I get to the other end, I'm all okay. So I look back asking Kieran if he felt that cold as well, except, well, he's not there. I stop the scooter right away and look back, and he is simply not there, vanished in the thin air. I know he couldn't have gotten off the scooter when we were crossing the bridge, just not physically possible to get off the scooter while it is being driven, sitting at the back seat. My mind could not comprehend what had happened, and in a daze, I drove the scooter back home, but didn't tell my aunt about the incident. I wasn't sure what had happened. Later that evening, after my uncle came back home, I asked him about Kieran. Found out that no one had seen Kieran for 2 days. He hadn't come to the shop or gone back to his home. It's been 15 years and Kieran has not been found. I do not know who I met that evening, who sat behind me on the scooter, who drove with me halfway through the bridge to simply disappear. So I live and work in a town on Cape Cod that's known for its Native American heritage. I've never believed in spirits or paranormal stuff before this, but what happened that day was observed by our entire crew, which was 4 people total that day. We were clearing a fire access path to get to the river in case of an emergency this particular week. Everything was going normal. It was early morning and we were nearing the end, and we had to clear about 100 feet diameter area so a fire truck could turn around, cutting trees and chipping them into a truck. So a short time before break, I look over near the river, and just before the river, about 150 feet away, I see a woman and a child maybe 4 to 5 years of age. What was interesting was that they were dressed in deerskin clothing. They were clear as day, clearly native. So I turn to my supervisor and tell him to look over there, and as I turn, they're gone. So I thought maybe I'm just seeing things, continue working. Leading up to a break, I get this intense level of sadness that starts building. I felt heavy, depressed, almost like I could cry. It was that intense. We stop for a break and I begin to explain what I saw, and just as this happens, across the river near the top of the trees is an intense ball of light. This is maybe 300 feet away. This ball is huge, like a mini sun, yellow in the middle to a blue around the edges. We all see this light, and it starts to move along the trees from our left to the right, and it disappears off into the distance. A minute or two later, we hear a loud drum beating from that direction. Three times. It felt like we shouldn't be there, and as we're walking away, I feel this rush of heat, like there's a fire on my back as we leave.